The sound of a Motorola numeric pager is something you never forget if you lived through the 1990s. It is a rhythmic, digital heartbeat, a sharp, insistent chirp that usually meant someone was waiting by a payphone for a callback. But at 4:12 a.m. on October 14, 1994, that sound was a death knell. In the small, rural town of Vane Creek, Tennessee, the silence of the autumn night was thick enough to swallow a person whole. The only thing moving was the frost creeping over the galvanized steel silos of the Vane farmstead. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a snapshot of a decade frozen in time. A Zenith CRT television hummed in the corner of the living room, its magnetic coils emitting that high-pitched, tooth-aching whine. The screen was a flat, electric blue, casting a haunting glow over a stack of Maxell Tone 120 VHS tapes piled on the coffee table. Lendl Vane, 16 years old, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He wasn't sleeping. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt and a pair of baggy, grease-stained jeans. A Sony Walkman was clipped to his belt, the grunge tape inside having hissed to a stop hours ago. His eyes were fixed on the pager, vibrating against the wood of his nightstand. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what the numbers said, but he did. 1031. In the language of the local sheriff's department, it was the code for a missing person. In the language of the Vane family, it was the start of a nightmare. Lendl's younger sister, 11-year-old Veda, was no longer in her bed. Unit 4. We have a code 1031 at the Vane property. The boy says his sister isn't in her room, but the grain silo is running. The farmhouse was a place of hard work and hidden resentments. Veda Vane was an ethereal child, the kind of girl who seemed too fragile for the heavy labor of a Tennessee farm. Her bedroom window was wide open when the first deputy arrived. The Tennessee wind pulled at the thin lace curtains, but the dust on the sill remained undisturbed. There were no scuff marks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Veda had simply evaporated into the cold midnight air. Ardenia Vane, the 38-year-old mother, was already standing on the front porch when the police cruisers turned up the gravel driveway. She was the image of 1990s rural resilience. Her hair, a feathered crown held in place by layers of aerosol spray, wearing high-waisted denim and a floral print blouse. She was a woman who had already seen too much tragedy. Her husband, Silas, had reportedly walked out on the family 2 years prior, leaving her to raise 2 children and manage a failing farm alone. "She's in the silo," Ardenia whispered to the deputy. Her voice was like dry corn husks. "I can hear it. Someone turned it on." Interactive moment. Before we dive into the evidence found on the porch that morning, where are you watching from today? Drop your city and the current time in the comments. It helps us track how far these stories travel across the world. Sheriff Elias Flint arrived at 4:27 a.m. Flint was a man who believed in the slow, deliberate process of analog investigation. He didn't have a mobile data terminal in his cruiser. He didn't have a digital database. He had a notebook, a heavy metal flashlight, and a Polaroid land camera. As he stepped out of his vehicle, the smell of diesel exhaust hit him. It was a heavy, sweet scent that didn't belong in the crisp morning air. On the front porch, sitting right next to a pair of discarded Reebok pumps, was a single VHS tape. It had no case. Across the plastic, the date was written in thick, black, permanent marker. October 14, 1994. The tape was still warm to the touch, as if it had just been ejected from a machine. Flint didn't go inside the house yet. He followed the sound. The north grain silo was humming. It was a deep, guttural vibration that shook the soles of his boots. The mechanical auger, the massive screw used to move the grain, was turning slowly in the dark. Flint clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness like a blade. Near the base of the silo, the light revealed fresh tire marks in the frost-bitten mud, wide base treads. These weren't from a tractor or a farm truck. These were the distinctive marks of a high-performance muscle vehicle, a 1990 Chevrolet SS 454. Then, the beam of the flashlight moved to the auger itself. Caught in the metal teeth of the machine was a small piece of fabric. Flint reached out with a gloved hand and pulled it free. It was Veda's nightgown, a pale pink cotton with a pattern of tiny blue flowers. It was shredded at the hem, the fabric torn as if it had been snagged in a hurry. But it wasn't the damage that made the sheriff's heart skip a beat. It was the blood. It wasn't a light spray. It was clotted, dark. It had been there long enough to begin to dry in the cold. The sheriff stepped back, the flash of his Polaroid camera illuminating the silo in a blinding white light. He watched the photo slide out of the bottom of the camera and waited for the chemicals to develop the image in the palm of his hand. He looked at the farmhouse. The blue glow of the Zenith TV was still visible through the living room window. Lendl was standing by the porch rail, his thumb nervously clicking the stop button on his Walkman over and over. Ardenia was weeping into a lace handkerchief, her eyes fixed on the sheriff. In that moment, Elias Flint didn't see a grieving family. He saw a stage, and he realized that in Vane Creek, the most disturbing secrets weren't buried in the woods. They were kept in plain sight, recorded on magnetic tape, and hidden behind the feathered hair and floral blouses of a perfect American family. Veda Vane was gone, and the grain silo was still running, chewing through the silence of the Tennessee night. Ardenia Vane was the kind of woman Vane Creek loved to pity. In the autumn of 1994, she was the town's living icon of quiet, rural suffering. She was a vision of domesticity frozen in the mid-90s, high-waisted denim, floral print blouses from the local JCPenney, and feathered hair held in a rigid crown by layers of aerosol spray. To her neighbors, she was a martyr. To the sheriff's department, she was the silo saint, a woman who had already lost her husband to the wind 2 years prior and was now watching her only daughter evaporate into the Tennessee night. But as the morning sun hit the galvanized steel of the silos on October 14, the cracks in that saintly image began to show. The Vane farmhouse was not a place of warmth. It was a museum of medical anxiety. Inside the kitchen, next to the wall-mounted payphone, Sheriff Elias Flint noticed a shelf lined with brown amber prescription bottles. There were local pharmacy labels from every clinic in the county. Veda, only 11, had a medical history longer than most 70-year-olds. According to Ardenia, the girl suffered from a rotating carousel of undiagnosed ailments, dizzy spells, sudden apnea, and a general fragility of the spirit that kept her out of school for weeks at a time. Psychological profiling, a field still finding its footing in rural law enforcement in the 1990s, would later identify Ardenia as a self-righteous offender. She didn't just care for the sick. She needed the world to watch her do it. She defined her entire identity through the control of her family unit. When her husband Silas reportedly walked out in 1992, she didn't just move on. She curated the narrative of a woman abandoned. Neighbors recalled her at the local Piggly Wiggly, weeping over the price of milk, while wearing a navy wool suit that looked like it belonged in a courtroom. In 1994, the term Munchausen syndrome by proxy was a whisper in the halls of specialized pediatric hospitals, but in Vane Creek it was unheard of. The doctors at the community clinic mistook Ardenia's obsessive care for maternal devotion. They didn't see the way she answered every question for Veda. They didn't notice that Veda only ever had a seizure when the room was empty of everyone except her mother. While Ardenia performed her grief for the cameras of the local news station, WAT-TV, her son Lendl was a ghost in his own home. Lendl Vane was the physical embodiment of 1990s teenage isolation. He was 16, a brooding figure who lived behind the hiss of a Sony Walkman. He wore oversized flannel shirts and smelled of clove cigarettes and stale laundry. But it wasn't his music that concerned Sheriff Flint. It was the Motorola numeric pager clipped to his belt. In the pre-digital era, pagers were the primary tools for a secret double life. They allowed communication that bypassed the family landline. When investigators seized the device in November, they found a history of numeric codes that sent a bone-deep shiver through the department. The screen of the pager was a graveyard of numbers: 333, 143, and the most disturbing of all, 187. In the slang of the 1990s, 187 was the California Penal Code for homicide. It was a number popularized by the gangster rap tapes Lendl listened to on his Walkman. When Flint asked the boy why someone would page him the code for a murder at 2 o'clock in the morning on the night his sister vanished, Lendl simply stared at the floor. "It's just a song, Sheriff," he muttered. "It doesn't mean anything." But the pager logs showed that Lendl had replied to that message with a code of his own. 405. "I've got a secret." The investigation was moving at the slow, manual pace of the analog era. There were no cell towers to ping, no GPS data to download. Detective Flint spent hours in the basement of the county courthouse, his eyes burning under the flicker of fluorescent lights as he used a microfiche reader to dig through the Vane family history. He was looking for Silas, the missing husband. He was looking for a pattern. What he found was a contradiction that changed the entire trajectory of the case. Silas Vane had supposedly left the family in 1992 to find work in Georgia. But when Flint looked up the social security number Ardenia had provided for her husband, the screen of the microfiche reader revealed a name that didn't match. The number belonged to a man who had died in a coal mining accident in 1978. Silas Vane didn't exist. The man Ardenia had been married to for 15 years was a ghost, a paper identity constructed out of stolen records and fraudulent management. The details of this case are starting to get heavy. If you think Ardenia is hiding a double life that goes deeper than just a missing child, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm we want more of these complex, deep-dive investigations. The forensic evidence found at the silo was equally frustrating. The blood-stained nightgown was sent to a private lab for RFLP restriction fragment length polymorphism DNA testing. In 1994, this was the gold standard, but it was a technology with massive limitations. RFLP required a sample the size of a quarter, and the DNA had to be pristine. The Tennessee soil near the silo was damp and acidic. By the time the technicians at the lab ran the electrophoresis gel, the DNA from the clotted blood on the nightgown had degraded. The radioactive probes used to visualize the genetic bands produced images that were nothing but a blurry, electric smear on the X-ray film. The results came back in December. Inconclusive. To the public, this meant the silo saint was still a victim. Ardenia took to the airwaves of the evening news, her face a mask of calculated tragedy. She looked directly into the camera of a bulky Betacam SP and pleaded with the stranger who had taken her daughter to bring her home. But then, a witness came forward. A local payphone technician, a man who spent his nights repairing the cast-iron units at the highway rest stops, reported seeing a vehicle near the Vane farmstead at 3 o'clock on the morning of October 14. He remembered it because it was a high-performance machine that didn't belong in a farming community, a 1990 Chevrolet SS 454 muscle truck. The truck was white. It had wide-base tires that matched the treads Flint had photographed in the frost. The technician claimed the driver was a man in his 30s with long, dark hair. He was sitting in the cab, the blue glow of a portable television illuminating a face that looked remarkably like the photos of the missing Silas Vane. The investigation was no longer just about a missing girl. It was about a house built on a foundation of stolen identities and rehearsals. Behind the Zenith television and the stacks of VHS tapes, the Vane family was a machine that was still running, chewing through the truth one magnetic frame at a time. If Veda was in that silo, she wasn't alone. And if the man in the white truck wasn't Silas, then Ardenia Vane was a woman who had been living a lie since the 1970s, a lie that was about to be interrupted by a ghost from across the ocean. By the winter of 1994, the Vane farmstead was no longer a private residence. It had become a studio set. The gravel driveway of the property was perpetually clogged with white satellite vans and news crews from across the country. In the pre-internet age, national attention was delivered through the aggressive, breathless lens of tabloid infotainment. Shows like Hard Copy, A Current Affair, and Inside Edition found their perfect narrative in Vane Creek, a grieving, saintly mother, a brooding teenage son, and a child who had disappeared into the maw of a running grain silo. The media didn't just report the news, they manufactured an atmosphere. Reporters in trench coats stood under the heavy Tennessee gray skies, their faces illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of portable halogen lights. They spoke in a rhythmic, staccato style that prioritized sensationalist theory over forensic data. Ardenia Vane was their star. She played the role with a devastating precision that only a 1990s mom chic icon could. She appeared on camera, wearing her navy wool suit, her hair perfectly feathered, her eyes always red-rimmed from weeping into a lace handkerchief. To the millions of viewers watching at home on their CRT televisions, Ardenia was the silo saint. She was the victim of a stranger danger, abduction, a narrative that gripped the American psyche during that decade. But behind the scenes, away from the rolling Betacam SP cameras, Sheriff Elias Flint was finding evidence that suggested the Silo Saint was a performance rather than a reality. The first crack in the stage came from a mundane discovery. During a secondary search of the farmhouse in December, a deputy noticed a small wooden nightstand next to Ardenia's bed. Tucked behind the drawer, held in place by a piece of yellowed Scotch tape, was a small Sony micro-cassette recorder. When Flint played the tape back in the quiet, cigarette smoke-filled interrogation room of the sheriff's office, he didn't hear the sounds of a mother in mourning. He heard a rehearsal. The hiss of the tape was a constant, rhythmic white noise. Then, Ardenia's voice came through the speaker. It was flat, cold. "My daughter is in the silo. I can hear it." Someone turned it on. There was a click. The tape stopped. Then, the same voice again, this time with more emotion, more breathiness. "My daughter. She's in the silo, please." I can hear the machine running. She was practicing her 911 call. She was tuning her grief like an instrument. Psychological profiling of the era was just beginning to understand the self-righteous family annihilator, a person who commits a crime and then immediately constructs a narrative of victimhood to maintain their social standing. Ardenia wasn't just grieving, she was managing her brand. What time is it there right now? Imagine you're watching the evening news in 1994 and you see this mother pleading for her child, only to find out later she was rehearsing her tears on a cassette tape. Would you have seen through the act? The investigation shifted its focus to the missing husband, Silas Vane. According to Ardenia, Silas had walked out in 1992, taking nothing but his clothes and leaving her to handle the debt. But in the pre-digital era, tracking a person meant manual labor. Flint spent 3 days in the windowless basement of the county courthouse. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the hum of the ventilation system. He sat at a microfiche reader, his eyes burning as he scrolled through the tiny backlit negatives of state birth and death records. He was looking for a paper trail for Silas Vane. What he found was a tombstone. The social security number Ardenia had provided for Silas was real, but it didn't belong to a man who had walked out in 1992. It belonged to a local man who had died in a coal mining accident in 1978. Silas Vane didn't exist. He was a ghost identity, a name Ardenia had stolen and used to build a life in Vane Creek. The man the town thought was the Vane patriarch was a fabrication. If Silas was a lie, then everything Ardenia had told the police since the morning of October 14 was suspect. While Flint was digging through the paper archives, a specialist from the State Bureau was finally decoding the messages found on Elias Vane's Motorola pager. In the 1990s, pagers were a language of their own. For a teenager like Lendl, they were a way to bypass the family landline and keep secrets in plain sight. The code 187, the homicide code, had been the primary focus, but the logs revealed a deeper, more disturbing conversation. At 2:15 a.m. on the morning of the disappearance, Lendl had received a page from a payphone at a rest stop on Interstate 75. The code was 405. In the secret language Lendl had established with the sender, 405 didn't mean a callback. It meant, "I've got a secret." Lendl's reply, sent at 2:20 a.m., was 187. To the police, this looked like a murder being coordinated in real time. But when Flint brought Lendl back into the smoke-filled interrogation room, the boy's grunge-era stoicism finally broke. "I wasn't talking to a killer, Sheriff," Lendl whispered, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the buttons on his flannel shirt. "I was talking to my uncle." Ardenia had told the town she was an only child, that her parents had died in a house fire in the late 70s. But the pager logs traced back to a white Chevrolet SS 454 muscle truck, the same vehicle seen by the payphone technician near the silo on the night Veda vanished. The driver of that truck wasn't Silas Vane. It was Ardenia's brother, a man named Hoke, who had been declared legally dead 10 years earlier. The investigation was no longer looking for a missing girl. They were looking for a family of ghosts. The silo saint was a woman who had lived under a dead man's name, raising a child with a ghost husband and communicating with a dead brother through numeric codes on a Motorola pager. Behind the blue glow of the Zenith television and the stacks of Maxell VHS tapes, the Vane farmhouse was a machine that had been running for 20 years, chewing through the truth and replacing it with magnetic static. The blood on the nightgown was still inconclusive. The silo was still silent, but the ghosts were starting to speak. As 1994 bled into 1995, the case of Veda Vane went cold, buried under the weight of analog limitations and the shifting focus of the 24-hour news cycle. The world moved on to the next tragedy. The Vane farmstead was left to the frost and the silence, until 1998, when a girl in a youth shelter in Spain claimed she was the ghost who had finally come home. By the spring of 1997, the Veda Vane case was no longer a headline. It was a local ghost story. The white satellite vans of the national news networks had long since packed up their heavy cables and moved on to the next American tragedy. The Vane farmstead had fallen into a state of adaptive stagnation. The galvanized silos, once the center of a forensic frenzy, were now just rusting landmarks in a town that had learned to live with a permanent question mark. Ardenia Vane remained in the house, a woman whose life had become a monument to 1970s-style domestic trauma. She still wore her hair in that rigid, feathered crown, and she still appeared at the local Piggly Wiggly in her navy wool suit, looking like she was perpetually waiting for a court appearance that would never come. Neighbors noticed that the silo saint had grown even more secluded. She was a woman who lived among stacks of VHS tapes and the high-pitched whine of her Zenith CRT television, her only connection to the world being the numeric codes that still occasionally chirped on her son's Motorola pager. Lendl, now 19, was no longer the brooding grunge fan. He was a shadow. He had been in and out of trouble with the local deputies for possession of beans, the slang for MDMA that was surging through the rural South in the late 90s. He spent his days in the cab of a white Chevrolet SS 454 truck, the same high-performance muscle vehicle that had been seen at the silo the night Veda vanished. To the town, the Vanes were a family of ghosts inhabiting a house built on static. Then came July 22, 1998. The miracle of Vane Creek didn't arrive with a phone call or a knock on the door. It arrived via a grainy satellite feed on the evening news. A youth shelter in Spain, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, reported that they had found an American teenager wandering the streets of Linares. The girl, appearing to be roughly 15 years old, claimed her name was Veda Vane. The story she told was a 1990s nightmare. She claimed she had been snatched from her bedroom window in Vane Creek by a child sex ring, transported across state lines in a white truck, and eventually moved through a series of European cellars. She spoke of 3 years of darkness, of being forbidden to speak English, and of chemical alterations performed by her captors to keep her hidden. The reunion was a media masterclass. Funded by a national news network in exchange for exclusive checkbook journalism footage, Ardenia and Lendl flew to Spain. The world watched on their CRT sets as Ardenia fell to her knees in a Spanish youth shelter, weeping into a lace handkerchief as she embraced the girl. "I know my daughter's heart," Ardenia cried out to the cameras. "This is my Veda." But for Sheriff Elias Flint, watching the reunion from his office in Vane Creek, something was fundamentally broken. Flint was a man of analog records and Polaroid evidence. He reached for a manila folder on his desk. The brass brad fastener rusted into the paper. Inside was the school safety day card. From 1994, the record of Veda Vane's, blue eyes and blonde hair. The girl in Spain had brown eyes. Her hair was dark and coarse. Her voice was layered with a thick, melodic French accent. She didn't recognize the family dog's name. She didn't remember the grain silo. When Flint asked her about the nightgown found in the auger, she stared at him with eyes that the sheriff later described in his notes as dead glass. The investigation was no longer about a recovery, it was about an imposter. By 1998, the forensic landscape had undergone a revolution. The failed RFLP testing of 1994, which required large samples and pristine DNA, was being replaced by STR short tandem repeat analysis. This new method could use a polymerase chain reaction to amplify tiny fragments of DNA, essentially molecular xeroxing, a profile from just a few skin cells. Flint didn't wait for the DNA. He went back to the primary technology of the decade, fingerprints. In the 1990s, the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS, was the new backbone of the FBI. Flint sent the new girl's prints to Washington, D.C., where a technician manually pulled the original 1994 card from a humidity-controlled records room. The results were definitive. The girl in the Vane farmhouse was not Veda. She was a 23-year-old European woman with a history of preying on grieving families to find the lost childhood she never had. She was a con artist, an expert in psychological manipulation who had studied the Veda Vane case on early internet message boards. But the real mystery wasn't that she was an imposter. The real mystery was why Ardenia Vane was still protecting her. Ardenia refused to provide a blood sample for the new STR DNA testing. She claimed the sheriff was persecuting a mother's love. She barricaded herself in the farmhouse with the fake Veda, the two of them living in a surreal loop of rehearsals and recorded memories. Flint brought Ardenia into the interrogation room in December of 1998. The air was thick with the scent of Merit cigarettes and the hum of a flickering fluorescent light. He slid a manila folder across the table. "Ardenia," Flint said, his voice as heavy as the Tennessee soil. "The girl in your house isn't Veda. You know she isn't. But you didn't fail the fingerprint test because she's an imposter. You failed because you swapped the records in my office 4 years ago using a stolen teletype key." The sheriff leaned in, the blue glow from a nearby monitor illuminating the sweat on Ardenia's forehead. "We ran the STR test on the blood from the nightgown again," Flint whispered. "Now that the technology has caught up, the blood isn't from a stranger, and it isn't from Veda. It's your blood, Ardenia. But the genetic profile says something impossible. It says you are the daughter of the girl who disappeared in 1994. The self-righteous performance finally shattered. Ardenia didn't weep. She didn't reach for her handkerchief. She simply stared at the sheriff with a look of bone-deep recognition. The investigation was no longer looking for a missing child. They were looking for the woman who had stolen a mother's life and spent 20 years rehearsing the role. Behind the Zenith television and the stacks of VHS tapes, the truth of Vane Creek was about to be dug out of the concrete foundation of the North Silo. We are minutes away from the most disturbing reveal in the history of this channel. If you haven't shared this video yet, now is the time to hit that share button. People need to see the final twist of the Silo of Secrets. The concrete slab at the base of the North Grain Silo was poured on October 28, 1994. At the time, Ardenia Vane told the local newspaper, the Vane Creek Gazette, that she was reinforcing the foundation to prevent the structure from collapsing under the weight of the autumn harvest. For 4 years, that slab remained undisturbed, a flat gray scar on the Tennessee landscape. To the neighbors, it was just a patch of masonry. To Sheriff Elias Flint, it was a lid on a tomb. In May of 1999, the search at the farmstead underwent a radical transformation. The era of the slow investigative process was coming to a close, and the tools of the new millennium were arriving early in Vane Creek. Flint didn't just bring deputies and shovels this time. He brought a team of forensic engineers equipped with ground-penetrating radar, a technology that used electromagnetic pulses to see through solid matter. As the radar unit rolled over the concrete, the monitor on the back of the machine flickered. The technicians saw what they called an anomaly, a pocket of air and a density shift roughly 4 feet beneath the surface. The search didn't just find Veda Vane. It found the architecture of a 20-year deception. Beneath the concrete was a small, hand-dug chamber. Inside, investigators discovered 2 sets of skeletal remains. They were wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, secured with duct tape, and buried alongside a collection of 1978-era household items, a set of Corningware dishes, a rusted I Love New York keychain, and a child's leather satchel. Do you think the detectives missed the warning signs back in 1994, or was Ardenia simply too good at her performance? What would you have done if you were the one holding that radar monitor? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The remains were transported to the State Forensic Lab. By 1999, the lab was fully operational with the Perkin-Elmer-Cetus DNA thermal cycler. This machine was the molecular Xerox of the decade, capable of taking the degraded, 20-year-old samples and amplifying the short tandem repeat or STR markers until a definitive genetic profile emerged. The results of the DNA analysis were delivered to Flint's office on a rainy Tuesday in June. He sat in his chair, the blue light from his computer terminal reflecting in his glasses. The report didn't just identify the bodies, it dismantled the very foundation of the Vane family tree. The first set of remains belonged to a woman in her late 30s. The DNA matched the dental records of the real Ardenia Vane, the woman who had supposedly been living in the farmhouse until that very morning. The second set of remains belonged to a man in his 40s. He was the real Silas Vane, the man who had supposedly walked out in 1992. Forensic analysis of the bones revealed that both had been dead since the late 1970s. This was the disturbing psychological revelation that brought the investigation to its knees. If the real Ardenia and Silas were buried under the silo in 1978, then who was the woman the world had been calling the Silo Saint for 20 years? Sheriff Flint returned to the farmhouse one last time. He didn't bring handcuffs. He brought the cassette recorder Ardenia had used to rehearse her grief. Ardenia, or the woman using that name, was sitting in the kitchen. She was wearing her navy wool suit. Her hair was perfectly feathered. She looked like a woman ready for a portrait, not a prison cell. "The blood on the nightgown from 1994, Flint said, his voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. "It was yours, wasn't it? But the STR profile says, you are the daughter of the woman buried under your silo." The woman finally looked at him. Her eyes were dead glass, devoid of the practiced tears the news cameras had captured for years. "I'm Veda," she whispered. The insane final twist was this. In 1978, the 11-year-old Veda Vane, the original Veda, had suffered under her mother's Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Her mother, the real Ardenia, had kept her in a state of medical sedation and physical abuse for years. One night, the girl snapped. She murdered her mother and father, then called her brother, Hoke, to help her bury the bodies beneath the grain silo. Veda didn't just kill her mother. She stole her. She took Ardenia's name. She took her clothes. She took her identity. For 20 years, the girl lived as the woman, aging into the role she had once feared. She used the 1970s archives and fraudulent records management to erase Veda from the world and replace her with a saint. But the cycle of domestic betrayal didn't end with the murder. Veda, now living as Ardenia, needed a surrogate. She needed a daughter to care for, so she could continue the only family dynamic she had ever known. In 1983, she abducted a 4-year-old girl from a grocery store in a neighboring county. She raised that girl as Veda, sedating her, sickening her, and keeping her in a state of arrested development for 11 years. The Veda, who disappeared in 1994, was that abducted child. She had finally learned the truth about her mother and tried to run. Veda, the killer, had used the grain silo to dispose of the evidence of her surrogate's existence, shredding the nightgown to make it look like a stranger danger abduction, while her brother Hoke waited in the white muscle truck to transport the child's remains to a different location. And the girl from Spain? She wasn't a con artist. She was the only biological child the killer ever had, a daughter born in secret in the late 80s and abandoned at a youth shelter because she wasn't sick enough to play the role Veda required. The girl had returned to Vane Creek with a fake story and a French accent, knowing she would fail the fingerprint test. She wanted to fail. She wanted the police to look closer at the records. She wanted to provide the DNA that would finally prove the woman she called mother was a total fabrication. The documentary ends not with a verdict, but with an image, a grainy surveillance still from a 1994 police interrogation. Ardenia Vane, the real Veda, is staring directly into the lens. She isn't crying. She is smiling. It is the look of a person who has finally finished the performance of a lifetime. This case reminds us that the people closest to us can be the best at hiding who they really are. If this ending left you as unsettled as it did me, leave a comment with your theory on why Lendl and Hoke stayed silent for so long. Was it fear, or were they just as trapped as the victims? Subscribe for our next deep dive investigation. I'll see you in the next one.